The candle nearest the window blew out on its own, though every door in the hall was shut. Odette froze at the top of the stairs, her hand still on the cold iron rail, and listened. Somewhere below, in the private chambers of Duchess Cecile, a trunk lid slammed shut, with more force than a trunk lid should ever need. She had worked in this house for 11 years. She knew every sound it made, the creak of the fourth step, the whistle of wind through the east chimney, the particular groan of the cellar door when the weather turned. This was not one of those sounds. This was the sound of something being taken away before its time. She went down anyway, because that was her habit, and because the Duchess had rung for her not 20 minutes before. Cecile was standing in the middle of her room when Odette entered, dressed for travel though it was not yet dawn. 2 trunks sat closed by the door. A third stood open, half filled, as though she had stopped partway through deciding what a person is allowed to keep. "You rang for me, my lady," Odette said. "I did." Cecile did not turn around at first. When she finally did, her face held the calm of someone who has already cried everything they intend to cry, and has moved past it, into something harder. "I am going to the country house. Tonight." "Tonight?" "My lady, the roads past Ashcombe are not safe after dark. There was a report only last week of—" "I know what the roads are like, Odette. I have traveled them before." Cecile's voice was even, controlled, the voice of a woman choosing every word with great care. "The Duke feels my health requires country air. He has arranged everything. The carriage is already being brought around." Odette had known Cecile long enough to hear what was not being said as clearly as what was. There was nothing wrong with the Duchess's health. She had walked the garden herself only yesterday, had laughed with the head gardener about the state of the roses, had eaten a full supper without complaint. A woman who is truly ill does not pack her own trunks at 3 in the morning with her jaw set like stone. "My lady," Odette said quietly, stepping closer, "is there anything you wish to tell me? Anything at all?" Cecile studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her traveling coat and drew out a small folded letter, sealed with plain wax and no crest. "If anything should happen in this house that seems wrong to you," she said, pressing the letter into Odette's palm, "you are to keep this. Do not read it unless you feel you must. Do not give it to anyone who asks for it directly. Only to someone you trust completely, and only if the need is real." "My lady, you're frightening me." "Good," Cecile said, and for the first time her composure cracked. Just slightly. Just at the corners of her mouth. "Someone in this house should be frightened. It should not only be me." Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, heavy and unhurried, the walk of a man who has never once questioned whether a room belonged to him. Cecile's spine straightened at once. She tucked a stray curl beneath her traveling bonnet, and became, in the space of 2 seconds, a picture of quiet obedience. The door opened without a knock. Duke Alaric Vane stood in the frame, still in his dressing gown, a man built like a door himself, broad and immovable, with a face that had once been called handsome, and was now simply called commanding. "You are still not in the carriage," he said. It was not a question. "I am nearly ready, Alaric." Nearly is not ready. He glanced at Odette, as though noticing a piece of furniture he had forgotten he owned. "You. Help her finish. The driver will not wait past the hour." "Yes, Your Grace." He left as suddenly as he had appeared, his footsteps fading back down the corridor toward his own study, where a lamp had been burning all night, Odette realized. She had seen the light beneath the door when she passed it earlier, and thought nothing of it. Now it seemed like the light of a man awake, because he had business to finish, not because he could not sleep. "He hasn't asked you to stay," Odette said carefully, folding a shawl into the open trunk. "Not once. Not a single word asking you to reconsider." "No," Cecile agreed. "He hasn't." 20 years, my lady." 20 years, Cecile repeated, and something in her voice broke just enough for Odette to hear the whole shape of the grief beneath it. And then it was gone again, folded away like the shawl, put someplace it could not be seen. "Finish the trunk, Odette, please. I would rather be on the road before the house wakes properly. I do not wish to say goodbye to people who do not yet know it is goodbye." They worked in silence after that. When the last trunk was closed, Cecile took one long look around the room that had been hers for 2 decades, at the window that faced the orchard, at the small writing desk where she had answered 1,000 letters, at the portrait of herself as a young bride that still hung crooked on the far wall, because no one had ever bothered to straighten it. "Take care of the house while I am gone," she told Odette at the door. "Take care of the people in it. They deserve better than they are likely to get." The carriage was already waiting when they came down, its lamps lit, the horses breathing steam into the cold air. The Duke did not come down to see her off. No one did, except Odette, and the driver, and the small dog that belonged to the head cook and had wandered out to see what the commotion was about. Cecile climbed in without help, settled her skirts, and looked once more at the great dark shape of the house rising against the paling sky. "Take the letter to Marjorie, if it ever comes to it," she said through the open window, so quietly that only Odette could hear. "She will know what to do with it. And Odette, do not trust anyone who tells you my health required this, not even if that person believes it themselves." The carriage pulled away before Odette could answer. She stood on the gravel drive until the lamps had shrunk to 2 small orange points, and then vanished around the bend of the eastern road, and she did not go back inside until the cold had gone all the way through her coat and into her skin, because some part of her understood, without being able to say exactly how, that she had just watched something end that could not easily be undone. Inside, the house was beginning to stir. A scullery maid crossed the hall carrying water for the morning fires. Somewhere above, a door opened and closed. Life continued, as it always did, indifferent to the small private catastrophes taking place beneath its roof. Odette went to the kitchen first, because that was where the truth of a house always settled eventually, in the low, warm room, where the staff gathered and spoke more freely than anywhere else on the grounds. Marjorie was already at the great stone oven, sleeves rolled to the elbow, flour dusted across her forearms like a light snow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marjorie said without turning around. "I might have," Odette answered, and told her everything. The trunks, the hour, the letter now folded small and hidden in the lining of her apron, the strange stiff calm on the Duchess's face. Marjorie set down her rolling pin very slowly. "Her health," she repeated. "That's what he's telling people. That's what he's telling people. There's nothing wrong with that woman's health, and everyone in this kitchen knows it. I served her breakfast myself 3 days running. She ate like a woman with an appetite for living, not one fading away." Marjorie wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture that seemed less about flour and more about needing something to do with her hands, while her mind worked through what she'd just heard. "He's been in that study every night this fortnight, lamp burning past midnight, and there's been letters coming and going that don't pass through the usual post." "What kind of letters?" "The kind carried by a man on a fast horse, who doesn't stop to take tea in the kitchen like the regular post rider does. The kind that arrive and leave again within the hour." Marjorie's eyes had gone sharp, the look of a woman doing sums in her head and not liking the answer. "You said she gave you something." "A letter. She said to bring it to you, if it ever came to that." "Then keep it close, girl, and don't breathe a word of it to anyone in this house who isn't already standing in this kitchen right now." Marjorie glanced toward the door, toward the corridor that led eventually to the Duke's study, as though she expected it to be listening. "Something is happening in this house, Odette. Something that started long before last night, and I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet." By mid-morning, the story had already changed shape twice, the way stories do when they pass from mouth to mouth, in a household full of frightened people trying to make sense of something no one has explained to them properly. The Duke himself gathered the senior staff in the long gallery to deliver the official account, standing very straight, hands folded behind his back, a man rehearsing lines he had clearly practiced. "The Duchess's physician has recommended country air for her nerves," he said. "She will remain at the Ashcombe cottage for some months, perhaps longer, until her health improves. In her absence, the running of this household will continue exactly as before. I expect no disruption and no gossip. Is that understood?" No one spoke. Stuart Gareth, a tall, thin man who had served the family since before the Duke himself was born, inclined his head in the smallest possible bow of acknowledgement. Housekeeper Agnes did the same. Odette kept her eyes fixed on a point just past the Duke's shoulder and said nothing at all, because she did not trust her own face not to show what she was thinking. The Duke's gaze passed over the assembled staff like a man counting sheep, satisfied that the flock understood its instructions, and then he left, his boots echoing on the polished floor of the gallery long after he had gone. "Nerves," Agnes said quietly, once the door had closed behind him. "That woman does not have nerves. That woman has more steel in her spine than half the men in this county. He said it like he'd rehearsed it, Greth murmured, word for word, like a boy reciting a lesson he didn't understand, but had been made to memorize. The staff dispersed slowly, back to their duties, but something had shifted in the air of the house, something that would not be easily set right again. A house runs on trust, as much as it runs on wages. Trust that the person at its head means what they say and says what they mean. And that trust had just taken a wound none of them could yet see the size of. That evening, as the last light drained out of the long windows of the dining hall, Odette found herself alone in the corridor outside the Duke's study. The door was ajar, just slightly, and through the gap she could see him seated at his desk, a letter open before him, his face lit gold by a single lamp. She should have walked on. She told herself so even as she stood there, unmoving, straining to hear. The arrangement stands, he was saying, to no one she could see, perhaps to himself, perhaps reading the letter aloud, the way a man does when he needs to hear his own decisions, spoken back to him to believe them real. By the season's end, everything as agreed. He folded the letter and pressed it to the flame of the lamp, watching it curl and blacken and fall away to ash in the dish beside him. Then he sat back in his chair, and for just a moment, before he composed himself again, Odette saw something cross his face that looked less like a man who had made a difficult but necessary choice, and much more like a man trying very hard to convince himself that guilt was the same thing as regret, and regret was the same thing as being sorry, when in truth, none of those three things had ever been the same at all. She backed away from the door before he could see her, her heart beating too fast, the small hidden letter in her apron lining suddenly feeling heavier than it had any right to feel, like a stone she was carrying, without yet knowing what it would be needed to weigh down. Upstairs, in the room that had until this morning belonged to Cecile, a chambermaid was already airing the linens and clearing the wardrobe, following instructions that must have come down sometime during the day, though no one could quite say from whom. By the time Odette climbed the stairs that night to her own small room beneath the eaves, the portrait of the young bride had been taken down from the wall entirely, and a bare, pale square marked the spot where it had hung, crooked, for 20 years. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake, listening to the house settle around her, every creak and groan now sounding like a question she did not have the answer to. And somewhere past midnight, she rose, lit a small candle, and took the folded letter from the lining of her apron. She turned it over in her hands, studying the plain wax seal, the absence of any crest or mark that might identify its sender or its purpose. She did not open it. Cecile had asked her not to, unless the need became real, and whatever this feeling in her chest was, whatever this cold certainty that something was deeply and quietly wrong in this house, she told herself it was not yet real enough to justify breaking a promise made to a woman who had trusted her with something more important than she yet understood. She hid the letter instead, inside the lining of an old sewing box, beneath a false bottom she had made herself years ago for keeping small private things safe from prying eyes. And she blew out the candle, and she lay back down in the dark, and she waited, the way the whole house seemed to be waiting, for whatever was coming next to finally show its face. The carriage that rolled up the long drive 3 weeks later was not the same carriage that had carried Cecile away in the dark. This one arrived at midday, polished and gleaming, drawn by a matched pair of white horses, and it carried a young woman who stepped down into the sunlight, as though she had been born knowing exactly how to make an entrance. Her name, the staff would learn within the hour, was Lady Seraphine Locksley, and she was, as of a small private ceremony held 2 days prior in the city, the new Duchess of this house. Odette watched from an upstairs window as the Duke himself came down the front steps to greet her, something in his bearing looser and lighter than it had been in months, a man visibly relieved to have finished a difficult piece of business and moved on to a more pleasant one. He took Seraphine's gloved hand and kissed it, and she laughed at something he said, a bright, easy laugh, the laugh of someone who has never had reason to doubt that life would continue arranging itself in her favor. She was beautiful in the way that paintings are beautiful, all clean lines and perfect proportion, with dark hair pinned in the fashionable style, and eyes that moved quickly over the front of the house, cataloging it, Odette thought, the way a person catalogs a thing they intend to own rather than a place they intend to belong to. By the time Odette came down to the hall, the senior staff had already assembled to receive the new mistress of the house, standing in their customary line, Gareth at the head, Agnes beside him, Marjorie having come up from the kitchen still in her apron, because there had not been time to change. "This is my household," the Duke said, presenting them with a small sweep of his hand, the way a man presents a collection of ornaments he is proud of, but does not entirely understand the value of. "Gareth, my steward. Agnes, who keeps the house. Marjorie, in the kitchens. And this is Odette, lady's maid." Seraphine's eyes passed over each of them in turn, quick and assessing, and lingered a beat longer on Odette than on the others, as though some instinct had told her this particular face belonged to someone worth watching. "I'm sure we shall get on very well," Seraphine said, her voice pleasant, carrying just the faintest edge of something harder beneath the pleasantness, like silk stretched over a blade. "I have certain preferences about how a household should be run. I trust you will all be willing to learn them." No one answered, because there was no answer that would not have sounded either false or dangerous, and Seraphine did not seem to require one. She swept past them into the house, as though she had lived there her whole life, the Duke following a half-step behind her, already pointing out this painting, that staircase, the good light in the morning room, a man eager to please a woman, still new enough to require pleasing. "Willing to learn them," Marjorie muttered, once they were out of earshot, "as if we haven't run this house better than she's likely ever run anything in her life." "She's young," Agnes said, though there was no real charity in the way she said it. "Younger than I expected, for a man his age looking to remarry so quickly." "Quickly," Gareth repeated, and the word hung in the air between them, heavier than it should have been for 2 syllables. 3 weeks. Cecile had been gone 3 weeks, and already there was a new duchess standing in her front hall, giving orders about morning light and household preferences, as though the house had been sitting empty and waiting for her arrival, rather than recently, hastily, emptied of a woman who had run it faithfully for 20 years. The first changes came within the day. Seraphine had the dining hall's old heavy curtains taken down, declaring them dreary, and ordered lighter ones sent for from the city, though nothing yet existed to replace them with, leaving the tall windows bare, and the room strangely exposed. She reorganized the seating in the drawing room, moved a cabinet that had stood in the same corner for 3 generations, and informed Agnes, with the easy confidence of someone who had never managed a household of this size, that she intended to review the entire domestic staff's duties within the week to see what improvements might be made. "Improvements," Agnes said to Marjorie that evening in the kitchen, in a voice flat with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has run something well for years and is now being told, by someone with far less experience, that it has been run poorly, as though we've been fumbling about in the dark all this time, waiting for her to arrive and show us the light. "She doesn't know the first thing about this house," Marjorie said, kneading dough with more force than the task strictly required. "Doesn't know that the west chimney smokes if you lay the fire wrong. Doesn't know the pantry floods in spring if the drain isn't cleared. Doesn't know a single thing, except how to look pretty in a doorway and give orders like she's always given them. Perhaps she'll learn. Perhaps. But learning takes humility, and I didn't see much of that in her this afternoon." Odette said little during these conversations, though she listened closely, turning over every detail the way she had once turned over Cecile's hidden letter in her hands, searching for a shape she could not yet name. That night, called to help Seraphine prepare for bed, she got her first real chance to observe the new Duchess up close, away from the performance of the front hall. Seraphine sat at the dressing table, while Odette unpinned her hair, studying her own reflection in the candlelight, with an intensity that seemed less like vanity, and more like a kind of private accounting, a woman checking to see whether the face in the mirror still matched the picture she carried of herself in her mind. "You served the previous Duchess," Seraphine said suddenly, not quite a question. "Yes, my lady." "For how long?" 11 years. Seraphine's eyes met Odette's in the mirror's reflection. "And what was she like, this previous Duchess? The Duke speaks of her so rarely, I've begun to wonder if there's something he's not telling me." Odette chose her words, with the care of someone walking across thin ice. "She was well loved in this house, my lady, by all the staff." "Well loved," Seraphine repeated, turning the phrase over, as though testing its weight. "That's an interesting thing to say about a woman one is meant to have replaced, due to poor health. One would expect a servant to say she was well, or unwell, not well loved, as though loved and gone were somehow related facts." Odette said nothing, keeping her hands steady on the ivory-handled brush, aware that she had revealed more than she intended, and unsure how much damage the slip had done. "You needn't look so frightened," Seraphine said, a small smile touching her mouth, though it did not reach her eyes. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I only find it curious, the way this whole house seems to hold its breath whenever her name comes up, as though she were a ghost, still walking the corridors, rather than a woman resting comfortably at a country cottage. The house was very fond of her, my lady, that is all it is." Seraphine turned back to her own reflection, apparently satisfied, or at least willing to let the matter rest for the moment. Well, the house shall simply have to grow fond of someone new. The days that followed brought a slow accumulation of small frictions, none large enough on its own to constitute a true grievance, but each one adding weight to a scale that was tipping, degree by degree, toward something none of the staff wanted to name aloud. Seraphine requested meals be served earlier than the household's long-established hour, then complained when the kitchen, unused to the new schedule, sent dishes up imperfectly timed. She asked Gareth to rearrange the household accounts in a manner he considered needlessly complicated, then found fault with his execution of her own instructions. She asked Agnes to dismiss a scullery maid for clumsiness, a girl of 14, who had worked in the house since she was 10, and had never before been the subject of complaint. "She doesn't understand how any of this works," Agnes said one evening, after the third such incident in as many days. "She gives instructions like a woman accustomed to being obeyed instantly, and without question, and when the results don't match what was in her head, she blames the people carrying them out, rather than the gap between what she asked for and what was actually possible." "She's not stupid," Odette said, surprising herself with the observation. "I don't think she means to cause harm. I think she genuinely doesn't know how much she doesn't know." "That may be true," Marjorie said, "but it doesn't make the harm any less real for the girl who's about to lose her position over a broken teacup that wasn't even her fault." In the end, it was Odette who quietly intervened, speaking to Agnes privately and suggesting the scullery maid be transferred to laundry duties rather than dismissed outright, a solution that satisfied the letter of Seraphine's complaint without destroying a child's livelihood over a household still finding its footing. Agnes agreed, relieved to have found a way through the difficulty that did not require confronting the new Duchess directly, and the matter was quietly resolved before it ever reached Seraphine's attention again. But the pattern had been set, and everyone in the house could feel it settling into place, like sediment at the bottom of a still pond, a young Duchess making decisions without understanding their weight, a household absorbing the cost of those decisions without complaint, and a Duke, too, absorbed in his own new happiness, to notice the quiet strain building beneath his roof. He was, in those early weeks, a changed man in ways the staff found almost unsettling to witness. Where he had once been distant and formal even with Cecile, he now lingered in Seraphine's company at every opportunity, laughed more freely, seemed years younger in his bearing. He took her riding through the eastern fields, showed her the family portraits with an enthusiasm he had never shown for his own history before, spent long evenings with her in the drawing room rather than closeted away in his study. It should have been, by any reasonable measure, a happy household, and yet Odette found herself unable to shake the sense that something essential had been hollowed out of the place, some quiet foundation removed and not yet replaced, leaving the whole structure standing but subtly, dangerously unsound. One evening, passing the study on an errand, she noticed the door standing open and the room empty, no lamp burning, no letters curling to ash in the dish beside the desk. She stood in the doorway a moment, remembering the scene she had witnessed there weeks before. The Duke's face lit gold. The words, "The arrangement stands. By the season's end. Everything is agreed. Spoken to no one but himself." She thought of the letter still hidden beneath the false bottom of her sewing box, of Cecile's instruction to keep it close and trust no one who claimed her health required this. She thought of Seraphine's strange, probing questions about the previous Duchess, the way she had said as though loved and gone were somehow related facts, as though some part of the new Duchess suspected, even without proof, that the story she had been told did not fully account for the silence surrounding her predecessor. Odette closed the study door quietly and continued on her errand, but the unease that had settled into her chest weeks ago had not lifted. If anything, watching this new bright chapter of the household unfold, she felt it deepen, the growing certainty that whatever had truly happened to Cecile, The house had not yet finished paying the price for it, and that price, whatever it turned out to be, was still quietly, patiently, coming due. The teapot shattered against the stone floor of the kitchen, and for a moment nobody moved, as though the sound itself had frozen the room in place. "That's the third this month," Marjorie said, staring at the broken pieces, without any real intention of picking them up right away. The Duchess wanted her tea brought up at 3:30 exactly, and 3:30 exactly is when I'm elbow deep in the sauce for supper. And there's only so many hands in this kitchen, Agnes. There's only so many hands. Agnes rubbed her temples. The strain of the past 2 months had carved new lines into her face. The particular exhaustion of a woman caught between two forces she could neither satisfy nor openly resist. "I'll speak to her again about the schedule. You've spoken to her 3 times already. Then I'll speak to her a 4th. It was not, on its own, a large problem. A broken teapot, a schedule not quite suited to the rhythms of a working kitchen, a young duchess who had not yet learned that a house does not bend instantly to a person's wishes simply because that person now owns it. But it sat atop 2 months of smaller frictions, each one a stone added to a wall that none of them had set out to build, and the wall had grown tall enough now that everyone in the house could feel its shadow. What none of the senior staff said aloud, though all of them thought it, was that the frictions with Seraphine were only half the trouble. The other half was quieter and older, and lived in the empty square on the wall where a portrait used to hang, and in Cecile's abandoned writing desk that no one had been given permission to clear, and in the letters that arrived every few weeks, addressed to no one, in handwriting the post-writer swore he did not recognize. "There was another one today," Gareth said that evening, when the 3 of them gathered in Agnes's small sitting room after the house had gone quiet, a habit that had become a kind of ritual over the past weeks, a place where the truth of things could be spoken plainly, without fear of being overheard by someone who might report it upward. "Another letter?" "Delivered to the side door, not the front. The boy who brought it wouldn't say who sent him, only that he'd been paid to place it directly in the Duke's hand, and no one else's."
"And did he?"
"Place it in the Duke's hand? I made certain of it," Gareth said. "I wanted to see his face when he opened it. And?" Gareth was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "Relief. That's the only way I can describe it. Not joy, not satisfaction. Relief. The look of a man who has been waiting for confirmation that something he set in motion has gone exactly as planned." The word plan hung over the room like smoke that would not clear. None of them had proof of anything. Not truly. Only a collection of small, strange details that refused to add up into an innocent explanation, no matter how they were arranged. The suddenness of Cecile's departure, the secrecy of the letters that had passed through the house in the weeks before and after, the swiftness of the new marriage, the odd relief on the Duke's face at news that arrived by unusual channels. "I keep thinking of something Odette told me," Agnes said, "about the study, about what she overheard, weeks before the Duchess left. The arrangement stands. By the season's end, everything is agreed. An arrangement for what? That's the question, isn't it? And I don't think any of us wants to say the word we're all thinking, because saying it makes it real, and once it's real, we can't simply go on serving supper and turning down beds, as though nothing has happened." No one said the word, but the shape of it sat in the room with them regardless, unspoken and enormous, and each of them carried it back to their own quarters that night, a weight they had not asked to bear. Odette, for her part, had begun quietly doing something none of the others knew about. In the small hours after her duties were done, she had started making inquiries, careful ones, of anyone who might have information about the arrangement Gareth had overheard, about the strange letters, about the true nature of Cecile's departure. She wrote, in careful, unassuming language, to a former housemaid who had left the Duke's service 2 years prior to marry a farmer in a neighboring county, a woman named Ivy, who had once been close to Cecile, and might, Odette thought, have insight worth having. The reply came back within the week, and Odette read it alone in her room by candlelight, her hands not quite steady. Ivy's letter was careful too, the careful writing of someone who understood she was treading near something dangerous, but it contained one detail that struck Odette like cold water. Ivy wrote that she had heard, through a cousin still employed in a house 2 estates over, that the Duke's finances had been in serious difficulty for well over a year before Cecile's departure. difficulties serious enough that there had been quiet talk among the county's other great families of debts unpaid, and creditors growing impatient. And Seraphine Locksley, Ivy noted, came from a family whose wealth, though newer and less celebrated than the Duke's own lineage, was considerable, and whose father had, by all accounts, been eager to see his daughter married into a title, regardless of the particulars. Odette sat with the letter for a long time after reading it, the candle burning low, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a shape she did not want to see, but could no longer avoid seeing. A duke in financial trouble. A wealthy young woman whose family wanted a title. A wife of 20 years sent away under a pretense of illness that no one who knew her believed for a moment. A new marriage, arranged with a speed that suggested it had been planned, well before Cecile ever packed her trunks. She thought of the letter Cecile had entrusted to her, still hidden beneath the false bottom of the sewing box, and for the first time since that cold morning 3 months ago, she wondered seriously whether the need to open it had finally arrived. She did not open it that night. Instead, she brought Ivy's letter to Marjorie, and Agnes, and Gareth, and the four of them sat together in Agnes's sitting room and read it through twice, and when they had finished, no one spoke for a long moment. "Debts," Marjorie said finally. "That's what this has been about. Not nerves, not country air. Debts. And a wife who was no longer useful to the solving of them. And a new wife, whose family's money could make the whole problem disappear." "We don't know that for certain," Gareth said, though his voice carried none of the conviction the words were meant to convey. "Don't we?" Agnes's voice was quiet but hard. "Look at what we do know, Gareth. Look at all of it laid out together. A rushed departure with no proper farewell. A story about illness that fit no one's observation of the woman in question. A new bride arriving within weeks, from a family with money enough to solve exactly the kind of trouble this letter describes. How many more pieces do you need before you'll say the word yourself?" Gareth did not answer, because there was no honest answer that contradicted her, only the discomfort of a man who had served this family faithfully for decades, and did not want to believe the master he served capable of what the evidence now strongly suggested. "What do we do?" Marjorie asked. "With what we know?" It was Odette who answered, and when she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that surprised even herself, the steadiness of someone who has spent months turning a fear over in her mind, and has finally arrived at the bottom of it. "We do nothing rash, not yet. We have suspicion, not proof, and suspicion alone is not enough to bring a man like the Duke to account for anything. But we watch. We remember. We keep what we know close, the way I have kept what my lady gave me close, and we wait for the moment when what we know can actually matter. And if that moment never comes, then at least we will have kept faith with a woman who deserved better than silence," Odette said, "even if silence is all we are ever able to give her." They parted that night, each carrying the same unsettled weight, the knowledge that the house they served had been built, however unknowingly on their part, upon a foundation of quiet cruelty dressed up as ordinary business, a wife discarded not for any fault of her own, but because her usefulness had run its course, and a more profitable arrangement had presented itself. It was the kind of knowledge that could not simply be unlearned, and it changed, subtly but permanently, the way each of them moved through the halls of the house they served. Within days, the change was visible even to those not privy to what the senior staff now knew. Small delays crept into the household's daily rhythms, nothing so obvious as open defiance, but a kind of quiet friction that had not existed before. Instructions took a few minutes longer to be carried out. Requests were fulfilled correctly, but without the warmth that had once accompanied good service. It was as though the house itself had begun, in small and deniable ways, to withhold something from the two people who now sat at its head, a slow and silent verdict passed by everyone who had once served the woman they had replaced. Seraphine noticed it before the Duke did. She was, whatever else could be said of her, not a stupid woman, and she began to sense, in the careful politeness of the staff around her, something that felt less like respect and more like performance. A household going through the motions of service, while withholding something essential beneath the surface. "They don't like me," she said to the Duke one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room after supper, her voice carrying a note of genuine puzzlement rather than complaint. "I've tried to be fair with them. I've tried to learn their names, to understand how things are done here. And still, there's something in the way they look at me." "You're imagining things," the Duke said, though he did not look up from the letter he was reading, a habit that had crept back into his evenings over the past weeks, despite his earlier attentiveness. "Servants are servants. They do their work and collect their wages, and their opinions of us are not our concern." "Perhaps," Seraphine said, though she did not sound convinced. And later that night, alone in her room, while Odette brushed out her hair, she asked, with a directness that caught Odette off guard, "Do the staff blame me for something, Odette? For the previous Duchess's departure, perhaps? I would rather know the truth of it than continue guessing at shadows." Odette met her eyes in the mirror, weighing the question with the same care she had weighed every question about Cecile since that first strange conversation months ago. "I could not say what is in anyone's heart but my own, my lady. But I will say this. The previous Duchess was loved in this house for 20 years, and love does not simply disappear because the person it was given to has gone away. Perhaps what you are sensing is not dislike of you, but grief for her, and grief takes longer to pass than most people expect it to." It was, Odette thought afterward, as honest an answer as she could give without breaking the promise she had made, an answer that told the truth without yet handing over the proof that would turn suspicion into open reckoning. Seraphine studied her for a long moment in the mirror's reflection, and something passed behind her eyes that Odette could not quite read, not quite suspicion, not quite understanding, but the first faint stirring of a question the young Duchess had not yet allowed herself to ask fully. Whether the story she had been given about the woman she replaced was the whole truth, or only the part of it that had been convenient for someone else to tell. The wine arrived cold, and the fire in the dining hall had not been lit at all, and the Duke sat at the head of his own table, in his own coat, with his breath visible in the chill air, staring at the untouched glass before him, as though it had personally insulted him. "This is unacceptable," he said, to no one in particular, because no one in particular was present to hear him say it. He rang the bell beside his plate once, twice, a third time, and the silence that answered him stretched on long enough to become its own kind of statement. Eventually a young footman appeared, new to the house and clearly unaware of the currents running beneath its surface, apologizing in a rush and hurrying to see the fire lit and the wine replaced. But the damage of the moment had already been done, not to the meal itself, which was easily enough corrected, but to something less visible and far harder to repair. It was the first time such a thing had happened in the 6 months since Seraphine's arrival, and the Duke dismissed it, as he dismissed most things that troubled the smooth surface of his life, as a simple failure of attention on the part of an inexperienced servant. He did not connect it, because he had no reason yet to connect it, to the quiet conversations that had been taking place for weeks in Agnes's small sitting room, to the slow accumulation of grief and suspicion among the staff, who had once served his first wife with such devotion. Odette, watching from the doorway as the footman rushed to correct his errors, understood the moment for what it actually was, in a way the Duke never could. The young footman had not forgotten the fire through simple carelessness. He had been told, by an older servant whose name would never be spoken aloud in connection with the incident, that the wood for the dining hall fire had run short that evening, and more urgent tasks had needed doing first. It was not quite a lie. It was also not quite the truth. It was the first small, deliberate stone laid in a wall, that the household, without ever holding a formal meeting to decide it, had begun quietly building around the Duke and his new wife. That night, in Agnes's sitting room, the four of them gathered again, and for the first time, the conversation took a different shape than it had before. "It wasn't an accident," Marjorie said. "The fire, I know it wasn't, because I was the one who told the boy the wood could wait." Gareth's eyebrows rose slightly. "You did that deliberately?" "I did. And I'm not sorry for it, not one bit. Let him sit cold at his own table for once. Let him feel, just for one evening, what it is to be made to wait on someone else's convenience, the way she must have felt every day of those last weeks before he sent her away." "That's a dangerous game, Marjorie," Gareth said, though there was less disapproval in his voice than the words themselves suggested. "If he learns it was deliberate, there will be consequences. For you, and likely for the rest of us as well." "Let there be consequences, then." Marjorie's jaw was set in a way none of them had seen before, the look of a woman who had finally arrived at the end of her patience, and found something harder and more resolved waiting on the other side of it. "I have served this family for 15 years. I served the Duchess with everything I had, and I watched her be discarded like an old coat that no longer fit the season's fashion. All so a debt could be paid with someone else's dowry. I am done pretending that nothing happened here. I am done serving supper with a smile to the man who arranged it. None of us have proof, Odette reminded her gently. Though even as she said it, she felt the same resolve stirring in her own chest, the same slow hardening that had been building in all of them for weeks. Only suspicion, and a letter from a woman 2 counties away. Proof is a luxury for people with the power to demand it, Marjorie said. We don't have that power. What we have is the running of this house, and for once, just once, I intend to run it in a way that serves justice rather than convenience. Agnes was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in her mind. If we do this, she said finally, we do it carefully. Not as open rebellion, not as anything that could be pointed to and named. Small things. Delays that could be explained 100 innocent ways. Mistakes that any household makes from time to time. Nothing that gives him grounds to dismiss any of us outright, because if we are dismissed, we lose whatever small power we still have to see this through to its proper end. And what is its proper end? Gareth asked. What are we actually working toward, if not simply making his life uncomfortable for a season, before he grows tired of the inconvenience and finds new staff who don't carry our history with them? It was a fair question, and none of them had a complete answer to it yet. But Odette, sitting quietly at the edge of the small gathered circle, found herself thinking of Cecile's face in the carriage window that cold morning months ago. The calm that had cracked just slightly at the corners of her mouth. The words, "Do not trust anyone who tells you my health required this, not even if that person believes it themselves." The truth, she said slowly, that is the proper end, not his discomfort for its own sake, though I won't pretend I feel any sorrow at the thought of it, but the truth of what happened to my lady, made known to whoever needs to know it, perhaps to Seraphine herself, who I do not believe was told the whole of what she married into. Perhaps to the wider county, whose good opinion still matters to a man like the Duke more than he would ever admit, and perhaps, if it can be managed, to my lady herself, so that she knows the household she loved did not simply forget her the moment she was gone. The room was quiet after she finished speaking, the 4 of them sitting with the weight of what she had said, and slowly, one by one, they nodded. Not in the manner of people embarking on some grand scheme of vengeance, but in the quieter, more determined manner of people who have simply decided, after a long season of grief and silence, that they will no longer pretend not to see what stands plainly before them. Over the following days, the small frictions multiplied, each one deniable on its own, each one adding to a pattern that grew harder to ignore with every passing week. A letter meant for the Duke's urgent attention sat unopened on the hall table for the better part of a day before anyone thought to bring it to him. A guest expected for luncheon arrived to find the invitation had somehow specified the wrong hour, an error no one could quite trace to its source. Seraphine's requests, once fulfilled with at least the appearance of eagerness, now met with a politeness so studied and correct that it began to feel, even to her, like something closer to mockery than service. She mentioned it again to the Duke, with more insistence this time. Something is wrong in this house. Alaric, I am not imagining it. Every day there is some small failure, some delay, some misunderstanding, and every day it is explained away as an accident, and I no longer believe in that many accidents. You are letting the idle talk of servants trouble you, the Duke said, though even he could not quite keep the irritation from his own voice now, the accumulated weight of weeks of small frustrations finally beginning to press on him as well. This nonsense will stop. But when he did speak to Gareth the following morning, summoning him to the study with a coldness that had not been present in their dealings for years, Gareth met his questions with a calm, unreadable composure that gave the Duke nothing solid to seize upon. Is there some difficulty in the running of this household that I should know about, Gareth? None that I am aware of, Your Grace. Households of this size will always have their small imperfections. I assure you, we do our best to keep them to a minimum. See that you do, the Duke said, and dismissed him, and Gareth left the study with his expression perfectly composed, giving away nothing of what he actually knew, nothing of the quiet, patient reckoning that had already begun taking shape beneath the Duke's own roof, invisible to him even as it grew, day by day, closer to a moment none of them could yet fully picture, but all of them, in their own ways, had already begun preparing for. A stranger arrived at the kitchen door on a Tuesday evening, asking for Marjorie by name, and by the time the conversation ended, the entire household's understanding of what had happened to Cecile had shifted once again, this time closer to something that could no longer be called mere suspicion. The stranger was a woman named Bess, travel-worn and cautious, who explained that she had been hired temporarily at the Ashcombe cottage where the former Duchess now resided, brought in to help with the modest household there while its usual staff recovered from illness. She had come, she said, because Cecile herself had asked her to, once she learned through careful inquiry that Bess would be passing near the Duke's estate, on her way home to her own family. "My lady asked me to bring word," Bess said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Marjorie had pressed into her hands the moment she arrived. "She said to tell whoever still remembered her, kindly, that she is well. In body at least. The country air has done her no harm." Whatever story was told to explain her removal. "And in spirit?" Agnes asked quietly. "How does she fare in spirit?" Bess considered the question with the care of someone unwilling to overstate a private grief that was not hers to share carelessly. "She grieves," she said finally. "Not for the house, I think, though she speaks of it fondly enough. She grieves for the manner of her leaving. She told me once, when she did not know I was listening closely, that 20 years of marriage had ended, not in an argument, not in a betrayal she could point to and name, but in a quiet arrangement she was never permitted to be part of, decided entirely by other people, for reasons she was never given the courtesy of hearing explained to her face." The kitchen was silent for a long moment after Bess finished speaking. Odette felt something tighten in her chest, an old grief finding fresh confirmation. "Did she say anything of the reasons?" Gareth asked carefully. "Even in passing? Even something she did not intend for others to hear?" Bess hesitated, glancing between the faces gathered around the table, clearly weighing how much further to go. "There was one thing," she said finally. "A letter arrived at the cottage some weeks ago, forwarded through a solicitor in the city, containing papers my lady had apparently been waiting for. I do not know their contents, but I saw her read them, alone in the small parlor, and I saw her weep for the first time since I began working there. Not the quiet, composed tears of a woman managing her grief in company, but the kind that comes when a suspicion long held finally becomes certainty. Do you know what the papers concerned?" I heard her say only one thing aloud, to herself, when she thought she was alone. She said, "So the debts are paid then, and I am the coin that paid them." I did not understand the meaning of it fully, but I have turned the words over many times since, and I do not think they need much explaining. No one at the table spoke for a long moment. The confirmation, when it finally arrived in such plain and simple language, landed with a weight none of them had quite been prepared for, even though every one of them had suspected some version of this truth for months already. "Debts," Marjorie said finally, echoing the word Cecile herself had used. "It is as we thought then. Not nerves, not country air. A marriage ended to solve a duke's money troubles, and a new one arranged to replace it, all while my lady was left to learn the reason for her own suffering second-hand, through papers forwarded by a solicitor, who likely never gave a moment's thought to how it would feel to receive such news alone in a borrowed parlor." Bess stayed the night, given a small room off the kitchen, and fed a proper supper before continuing her journey the following morning. And before she left, she pressed something small into Odette's hand, a folded note, sealed the same plain way Cecile's earlier letter had been sealed. "She asked me to give you this, particularly," Bess said. "She said you would know what to do with it." Odette waited until she was alone in her room that night, before she opened it, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal, aware that this letter, unlike the first, had been written with the express intention of being read. Cecile's handwriting filled the small page, neat and careful, despite whatever grief had accompanied its composition. "Odette," it began, "I trust the household still stands, and that you and the others who were kind to me have found some measure of peace in my absence, though I imagine peace has been in short supply, given what I now understand of the true circumstances of my leaving. I will not burden you with the full details, which are ugly enough that I would rather spare you them if I can, but I will say this. What was done to me was not an act of illness or misfortune. It was a decision, made without my knowledge or consent, by a man who found it more convenient to solve his financial troubles through my removal than through honest conversation with the wife who had stood beside him for 20 years. I do not tell you this to stir trouble in a household that has already, I imagine, suffered enough disruption on my account. I tell you because you asked me to trust you with the letter I gave you before I left, and I think the time has come for you to understand what it contains, should you ever judge the moment right to open it. It holds proof, Odette, proof of the arrangement, in the Duke's own hand, sent to me by a solicitor who felt some final obligation to honesty, even after the deed itself was done. I do not know what use such proof might be to you, or to anyone still in that house, but I leave the decision of what to do with it entirely in your hands, trusting the judgment of a woman who served me faithfully for 11 years and never once gave me cause to doubt her. Whatever you decide, know that I think of the household and its people with warmth, even now, and I bear none of you any ill will for whatever choices you have had to make in my absence. With affection, Cecile. Odette sat with the letter for a long time after reading it, the candle burning low beside her, and then she rose, crossed to the sewing box hidden in the corner of her small room, and drew out the false bottom, revealing the first letter Cecile had given her that cold morning months ago, still sealed, still waiting. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight differently now than she had felt it before, no longer simply a promise kept, but a key to something that could change the entire shape of what was happening in this house. She thought of Marjorie's deliberate cold fire, of Gareth's careful, unreadable calm before the Duke, of Agnes's warning that they must proceed carefully, of her own words weeks ago about the truth being the proper end they were working toward. She broke the seal. Inside was a single folded document, and as she read it by candlelight, her breath caught in her throat. It was, exactly as Cecile had promised, written in the Duke's own hand, a private letter addressed to a solicitor in the city, dated some months before Cecile's departure, laying out in plain and businesslike language an arrangement between himself and the family of Lady Seraphine Locksley, wherein a substantial sum would pass to him upon the successful conclusion of a marriage, contingent upon his current wife being removed from the household by whatever means could be quietly arranged before the new arrangement was finalized. There it was, in ink that could not be argued away or explained as misunderstanding, the plain and ugly truth that every member of the household had suspected for months, but never before had the means to prove. Odette folded the document carefully and returned it to its hiding place, her mind already turning toward the question of what came next, of how such proof might be used, of who among the household needed to see it and who did not, of whether the moment had finally arrived that Cecile had spoken of, the need becoming real enough to justify the trust that had been placed in her. She did not sleep that night, and when dawn finally broke over the estate, she rose with a clarity of purpose she had not felt since the morning Cecile's carriage had disappeared around the bend of the eastern road, the growing certainty that the household's long season of quiet grief and careful waiting was drawing, at last, toward its end. The Duke's temper broke fully, for the first time in living memory, over a matter so small it embarrassed him, even as he raged, a misplaced set of correspondence that delayed an important meeting with a visiting land agent by nearly an hour, leaving the man standing in the front hall with nothing to do but study the empty square on the wall where a portrait had once hung. "This household has become a disgrace," the Duke said, pacing the length of his study, while Gareth stood before him with the same maddening composure he had maintained for weeks. "Letters go missing, meals arrive late or wrong, guests are kept waiting. I built this household's reputation over 20 years, Gareth, and in the space of a few months, it has fallen into a state of disorder I would not have tolerated from a house half its size. I am sorry to hear you feel that way, Your Grace. I assure you every effort is made to maintain the standards you expect." "Efforts are not results, Gareth. I do not pay for effort. I pay for a household that runs as it should." The Duke stopped pacing and fixed his steward with a look that carried, for the first time, something closer to genuine suspicion than simple irritation. "Is there something happening in this house that I am not being told about?" Gareth held his gaze without flinching, a skill built over decades of service to a family that had not always deserved the loyalty given to it. "I could not say, Your Grace. Households have their seasons, as anything else does. Perhaps this is simply an unfortunate one." It was not a satisfying answer, and both men knew it. But it was also not a lie precise enough to be caught and challenged, and the Duke, lacking any concrete grievance to press further, was forced to let the matter drop, dismissing Gareth with a curtness that had not existed between them before this season of quiet friction began. What the Duke could not see, absorbed as he was in his own frustrations and his own increasingly strained new marriage, was the degree to which his household had already, in every meaningful sense, stopped being his. The staff still performed their duties, still collected their wages, still moved through the halls in the outward forms of loyal service. But the substance of that loyalty had shifted entirely, redirected toward a woman 2 counties away, who had once trusted them with her comfort and her confidence, and away from the man who now sat, increasingly isolated, at the head of a table that no longer truly belonged to him in any way that mattered. Seraphine felt the isolation even more acutely than her husband did, and unlike him, she had begun to actively search for its cause, rather than simply complain about its symptoms. She had noticed, over the preceding weeks, a particular quality to the way the staff regarded her, not open hostility, which she might have been able to confront directly, but something more like patient, careful distance, as though they were all waiting for something to happen that she alone did not yet understand. She began, quietly and without her husband's knowledge, to ask questions of her own. She asked the young footman, new enough to the house to lack the deep loyalties the older staff carried, what he knew of the previous Duchess's departure, and received only vague, careful non-answers that told her more through their evasiveness than any direct statement could have. She asked a visiting neighbor, an older woman who had known the family for decades, whether Cecile's health had truly been the cause of her removal to the country, and watched the woman's face carefully as she offered a polite, non-committal answer that did not quite meet Seraphine's eyes. And one afternoon, finding herself alone in the study while the Duke was away inspecting the eastern fields, she did something she had not done before. She opened the drawers of his desk, one by one, searching for she did not entirely know what, only the vague sense that somewhere in this room, in this house, there existed an explanation for the strange atmosphere she had been living inside for months, without ever quite understanding its source. She found nothing definitive, the Duke having long since burned whatever correspondence might have implicated him directly, but in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of unremarkable household ledgers, she found a small bundle of letters from a solicitor in the city, dated across the months before her own marriage, discussing in careful, formal language matters of debt and settlement that she could not fully parse, but which stirred, deep in her chest, the first cold thread of genuine alarm. She read them twice, then returned them exactly as she had found them, her hands not quite steady, and sat for a long while in the chair behind the Duke's desk, staring at nothing, turning over in her mind the pieces of a puzzle that had been assembling itself around her for months, without her full awareness. That evening, she said nothing to the Duke about what she had found, but something in her manner had changed, a new watchfulness in the way she observed him across the dinner table, a new quality to her silences. She found herself, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely wondering about the woman she had replaced, not with the idle curiosity of before, but with a dawning, uncomfortable empathy. The recognition that whatever had happened to Cecile might not be entirely unrelated to the growing unease she herself now felt in this house, that was supposedly, by every legal and social measure, now hers. She sought out Odette again, later that night, with a directness that carried none of the earlier playfulness of their first conversations. "I want you to tell me the truth," Seraphine said, as Odette worked through her hair with the ivory-handled brush. "Not the careful, polite version you gave me before. The whole truth, whatever it cost you to say it." Odette met her eyes in the mirror, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, each weighing the other, each understanding that whatever was said next could not be unsaid. "My lady," Odette began carefully, "there are things I know that I have promised not to share carelessly, but I will tell you this much. Whatever you have begun to suspect about the manner of the previous Duchess's departure, I do not think your suspicions are wrong." Seraphine's face, reflected in the candlelit mirror, went very still. "Say it plainly, Odette. Please. I am tired of everyone in this house speaking to me in riddles. I am not certain it is my place to say more than I already have, my lady. But I will say that if you continue asking the questions you have already begun asking, you will likely arrive at an answer neither of us will find comfortable, And when that day comes, I hope you will remember that not everyone in this house wished harm upon you personally. Some of us only wished for the truth to eventually be known, whatever shape that truth turned out to take. It was as far as Odette was willing to go that night, and Seraphine, sensing the boundary even if she did not fully understand its reasons, did not push further, though the seed of understanding had already been planted, and it would not be long, both women somehow already knew, before it grew into something that could no longer be contained by careful silences and half-spoken truths. The household continued its quiet, patient work of withholding, the small frictions accumulating day by day, and the Duke continued to sense, without understanding, that the ground beneath his feet had grown less solid than he had ever imagined it could become, and somewhere in the growing distance between suspicion and certainty, the final act of this long, quiet reckoning was already beginning to take its shape. The great bell in the front hall rang for a full minute before the Duke, seated alone at the head of his own dining table, finally understood that no one was coming. It had begun as an ordinary evening. The Duke had ordered a formal supper prepared, intending to host a small gathering of local gentry the following week, and wishing to test the household's readiness beforehand. A rehearsal of sorts for an evening, meant to reassure the county that his household, and his new marriage, stood on solid and respectable ground. The table had been set with the family's finest china, candles lit down its full length, the good silver polished and arranged with the precision the house had always been known for. And then, at the hour supper was meant to begin, nothing happened. The Duke sat at the head of the table, his wife beside him, both dressed for the evening, both waiting for the first course to be brought in, as it had been brought in 1,000 times before, across the 20 years and more that this house had stood. The minutes passed. No footman appeared. No dish arrived. The candles burned steadily down their lengths, and the silence in the room grew from mere quiet into something heavier, something that pressed against the walls of the great hall like a physical presence. "Ring the bell again," the Duke said, and Seraphine did, and still no one came. He rose from the table himself, finally, his patience exhausted, and walked the length of the corridor toward the kitchen, expecting to find some minor catastrophe. A fire gone out, a dish ruined, some ordinary domestic disaster that would explain the delay and be quickly remedied. What he found instead was a kitchen standing empty, the ovens cold, the supper he had ordered sitting finished and ready on the long preparation table, covered and untouched, with no one present anywhere in the room to bring it through to the hall. "Marjorie," he called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Agnes, Gareth, someone, answer me." No one answered. He moved through the house then, room by room, his confusion curdling slowly into something closer to alarm, finding every corner of the servants' quarters empty, every corridor silent, every door standing open onto rooms with no one in them. It was as though the entire staff of a house that employed nearly 20 people had simply vanished into the evening air, leaving behind only the finished, waiting supper and the burning candles in the dining hall. He found them, finally, gathered in the courtyard behind the kitchens, standing together in a loose group in the cooling evening air. Gareth at the front, Agnes and Marjorie beside him, Odette a step behind, and every other member of the household staff arranged in a rough semicircle around them, none of them moving to return to their posts, all of them simply standing, waiting, the way a jury waits before delivering a verdict it has already decided. "What is the meaning of this?" the Duke demanded, his voice carrying the full weight of a man unaccustomed to being defied in any way, by anyone. "I have guests arriving within the week, and a household that cannot even manage a simple rehearsal supper. Explain yourselves, all of you, immediately." For a long moment, no one spoke. The Duke's eyes moved across the assembled faces, searching for the weakness he was certain must exist somewhere in this strange, unified silence. Some servant whose nerve would break first and give him the thread he could pull to unravel whatever conspiracy had produced this scene. But no such weakness appeared. Every face before him held the same steady, unflinching calm, the calm of people who had made a decision together and did not intend to abandon it now that the moment of confrontation had finally arrived. It was Gareth who finally spoke, his voice carrying none of its usual careful deference, stripped instead to something plainer and harder than the Duke had ever heard from him before. "We will not serve this house tonight, Your Grace. Not until certain matters have been properly addressed." "Matters," the Duke repeated, his voice rising. "What matters, Gareth? Speak plainly, or I will have every one of you dismissed from this estate before the sun rises tomorrow." "You may dismiss us if you wish," Gareth said. "It will not change what we have to say, and I think, when you have heard it, you will understand why none of us are especially frightened by the threat." Seraphine had followed her husband out into the courtyard, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and now stood a few steps behind him, her face pale in the fading evening light, her eyes moving across the assembled staff with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting, without quite admitting it to herself, for exactly this moment to finally arrive. "Say what you have to say then," the Duke said, his voice tight with a fury that was already beginning to curdle, at its edges, into something closer to fear. "Say it plainly, and be done with this foolishness." Gareth glanced once at Odette, a small silent question, and Odette gave the smallest nod in return, a signal that had been agreed upon in whispered conversation only an hour before, when the household had gathered in the kitchen and decided, together, that the moment Cecile had spoken of, the moment the need became real, had finally, truly arrived. "We know why the previous Duchess was sent away," Gareth said. "We know it was not her health that required it. And we know, Your Grace, precisely what arrangement was made to replace her, and precisely what it cost her, and precisely what it was worth to you." The courtyard fell utterly silent. Even the evening birds seemed to have stopped their calling, as though the whole world had paused to witness the moment the Duke's carefully constructed story finally, irrevocably, began to come apart. The Duke's face, in the dying light, went through several transformations in the space of a few seconds, from fury to disbelief, to something far more naked and unguarded. The particular helplessness of a man watching a truth he had believed safely buried begin to claw its way back up into the light of day, in front of the one person in the world he had least wanted to hear it. "I do not know what nonsense you have all convinced yourselves of," he began, his voice attempting authority and finding, instead, only a thin and unconvincing bluster. "But I will not stand here in my own courtyard and be spoken to in this manner, by my own staff." "Then perhaps," Gareth said quietly, "you would prefer to be spoken to about it inside, Your Grace, in front of your wife, since it concerns her more directly than perhaps anyone else standing in this yard tonight." Seraphine's eyes moved to her husband's face, and whatever she saw there, in the sudden pallor of his skin, in the way his composure had entirely deserted him, seemed to answer some question she had been carrying quietly for weeks, long before the household had ever decided to speak a single word of what it knew. "Alaric," she said, very quietly, into the silence that followed, "what is he talking about?" The Duke did not answer. He stood in the gathering dark of his own courtyard, surrounded by a household that had, in the space of a single evening, stopped pretending to serve him, and had instead become, without ever raising a hand or a voice beyond what was necessary, something closer to a court, assembled to hear the truth of a case that had waited far too long to finally be tried. "Show her," Marjorie said, breaking the silence that had stretched taut across the courtyard, since Seraphine's quiet question had gone unanswered. "Odette, show her what you have." Odette stepped forward, her hand already moving to the pocket of her apron, where she had carried the folded document since the moment, hours earlier, when the household had gathered and agreed that tonight, finally, was the night truth would no longer be kept waiting in a hidden sewing box. "My lady," she said, addressing Seraphine directly, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart, "I do not do this to cause you pain. I do it because you deserve to know the truth of what you have married into, and because another woman, who trusted me with this proof before she was sent away, deserves to have her name cleared of the false story that was told about her departure." She held out the letter. Seraphine took it with hands that were not entirely steady, and unfolded it in the dying light, and began to read. The Duke moved as though to snatch it from her grasp, a sudden lurching motion born of pure panic, but Gareth stepped smoothly into his path, blocking him with nothing more than his own body, and the quiet, immovable authority of a man who had decided, after decades of faithful service, that this was the one moment worth risking everything to hold his ground. "Let her read it, Your Grace," Gareth said. "She has as much right to the truth as any of us standing here." The Duke's fury broke fully then, a wordless sound of frustration and cornered desperation, but there was nothing left for him to do, no lever remaining that he could pull to stop what was already, irreversibly, happening. Seraphine read the letter through once, then again, her face growing paler with each line, until finally she looked up from the page and met her husband's eyes across the courtyard. And something in her expression had changed entirely. The last remnants of the easy, confident young woman who had arrived 6 months earlier, now replaced by something far harder and colder. "You arranged for your wife to be removed," she said slowly, "so that my father's money could settle your debts. And then you married me, knowing all the while what you had done to make that marriage possible. And you let me believe, all these months, that she had simply grown ill and needed rest. Seraphine, it is not as simple as that letter makes it seem. Is it not?" Her voice rose now, carrying across the courtyard with a force none of the assembled staff had heard from her before. "Explain to me then, Alaric, what part of it is complicated. Explain to me what nuance exists in a letter that plainly states you would remove your wife from this house in exchange for my father's money. Explain to me what subtlety I am missing." The Duke had no answer, because there was no answer that could soften what the document plainly said. No interpretation that could transform a business arrangement built on the quiet cruelty of discarding a 20-year marriage into anything resembling an innocent misunderstanding. "I did what I believed was necessary," he said finally, his voice small now, stripped of all its earlier authority, the voice of a man who had run out of every strategy except the truth itself. "The estate's debts had grown beyond what I could manage through ordinary means. Your father's fortune offered a solution. Cecile understood, in her own way, that the marriage had run its natural course, that—" "Do not," Seraphine said, cutting him off with a coldness that silenced him instantly. "Put words into that woman's mouth to excuse what you did to her. You sent her away in the dark, with no proper farewell, and told a household that clearly loved her a story you knew to be false, and you did all of it so quietly and so efficiently that I arrived in this house 6 months ago without the faintest idea that I was walking into the wreckage of a cruelty, dressed up as simple misfortune." She turned to the assembled staff then, her eyes moving across their faces, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, the recognition of people who had carried a painful truth in careful silence for months, rather than expose her to it carelessly. "You could have told me sooner," she said. "Any of you." "I would have wanted to know. We did not know how you would receive it, my lady," Agnes said gently. "Whether you were part of the arrangement knowingly, or as much a victim of it as the woman who came before you, we needed to be certain before we spoke, and certainty of this kind is not easily come by in a house where the truth has been so carefully hidden. And now that you are certain—" "Now," Gareth said, "we thought you deserved to hear it plainly, and to decide for yourself what you wish to do with the knowledge, rather than continue living inside a story that was never true to begin with." Seraphine looked down at the letter still held in her trembling hands, then back up at her husband, who stood alone now in the center of the courtyard, stripped of every defense he might once have raised, surrounded by a household that had finally, after months of careful patient waiting, delivered its verdict in the plainest terms possible. "I want to see her," Seraphine said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else present, the previous Duchess. "I want to hear, from her own mouth, what was done to her, before I decide what I intend to do about the position I have unknowingly been placed in." "That can be arranged, my lady," Odette said, "if you wish it." "I do." Seraphine folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the sleeve of her gown, a gesture of quiet, deliberate ownership, as though she understood already that this proof, once merely evidence of a wrong done to someone else, had now become evidence of a wrong done to herself as well, evidence she did not intend to let disappear back into hiding, now that it had finally seen the light. The Duke made one final attempt at authority, his voice rising with the last reserves of a temper that had governed this household unquestioned for 20 years. "This is still my house, and you are still my staff, every one of you, and I will not stand for—" "You will stand for whatever we decide to give you, Your Grace," Marjorie said, stepping forward with a boldness that would have been unthinkable to her 6 months earlier. "And tonight, we have decided you will stand for a cold supper and an empty dining hall, because that is precisely what a man deserves who sat comfortably at his own table, while the woman who once sat beside him was cast out into the cold with nothing but a false story to explain why. No one moved to correct her. No one moved to serve the meal still sitting finished and untouched in the empty kitchen. The Duke stood alone in the gathering dark of his own courtyard, his authority stripped away piece by piece over the course of a single evening, and understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it truly meant to lose something that could not be bought back with any amount of careful arrangement or convenient money. The cottage at Ashcombe sat at the end of a narrow lane lined with hedgerows, smaller and plainer than anything Seraphine had ever lived in, and yet when the carriage finally drew to a stop before it 3 days after the confrontation in the courtyard, she found herself hesitating at the door, uncertain, for the first time in a long while, of what words could possibly begin the conversation she had come all this way to have. Cecile answered the door herself, no servant announcing the visit, and for a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other across the threshold, the woman who had been discarded, and the woman who had, however unknowingly, been the instrument of that discarding. "I did not expect you," Cecile said finally, her voice careful, giving nothing away. "I did not expect to come," Seraphine admitted, "but I have read the letter, and I have heard from the household what was done to you, and I could not go on living in that house without first hearing your own account of it, whatever that account might cost either of us to speak aloud." Cecile studied her for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. An invitation. "Come in, then. I imagine we have a great deal to discuss, and it is better discussed with tea than without it." They sat together in the cottage's small parlor, sunlight falling through a window that faced a modest garden, and Cecile told her everything, plainly and without embellishment, the sudden summons to the study, the story of failing health invented for her without her consent, the cold hour before dawn, when she had packed her own trunks, and left the only home she had known for 20 years, without a single word of proper farewell from the man she had married. "I do not tell you this to make you feel guilty for a decision that was never yours to make," Cecile said, when she had finished. "You were as much a piece moved in this arrangement as I was, only you were moved toward gain rather than away from it. I do not believe you knew, when you agreed to the marriage, what price had already been paid to make it possible." "I did not know," Seraphine said quietly. "I want you to believe that, whatever else you think of me." "I do believe it," Cecile said. "I have had months to think on this, alone in this cottage, and I have come to understand that anger aimed at you would be anger aimed in the wrong direction entirely. The man who arranged all of this is the one who deserves whatever reckoning is still to come, not the young woman he used as the solution to a problem of his own making." Seraphine sat with that for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. "What do you intend to do now, with the truth finally known?" "I have given the matter some thought," Cecile said. "I do not wish to return to that house, whatever legal claim I might still hold to it. Too much has happened there that I would rather leave behind me entirely. But I do not intend to let the matter rest quietly either. What was done to me was not merely unkind, Seraphine. It was, I believe, actionable under the law. A marriage dissolved through deception, and a wife discarded through a fraud, dressed up as a medical necessity. I have already begun making inquiries of a solicitor in the city, a fair and honest man, about what recourse the law might offer a woman treated as I was treated. And what will become of him, of Alaric? That, I imagine, will depend a great deal on what you decide to do," Cecile said, studying the younger woman carefully. "You hold a position now that I did not have when all of this began. You are still legally his wife, whatever the true circumstances of how that marriage came about, and your own family's resources give you a kind of standing in this matter that I, alone and without support, did not have available to me at the time. If you chose to support a full accounting of what was done, both to yourself and to me, I believe it would matter a great deal." Seraphine was quiet for a long time, staring out the small window at the modest garden beyond it, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a resolve that had not been present when she first arrived at the estate 6 months ago, full of easy laughter and unquestioning confidence in a life she had assumed would simply arrange itself in her favor. "I will support it," she said. "Whatever accounting is owed, I will not stand in its way, and I will not pretend, any longer, to be the contented wife of a man who built our marriage on a foundation of such deliberate cruelty." They talked for hours after that, the conversation gradually softening from the hard business of reckoning into something gentler, two women finding, unexpectedly, a kind of understanding in each other that neither had anticipated when the carriage first drew up outside the cottage door. By the time Seraphine finally rose to leave, the sun had begun sinking toward the hedgerows, and something had shifted between them, Not quite friendship, not yet, but the first careful beginnings of something that might, given time, grow into a genuine regard. "Thank you," Cecile said, walking her to the door, "for coming to hear this from me directly, rather than simply believing whatever convenient story might have been offered to explain it away. Not many in your position would have made that choice." "I could not have lived with myself otherwise," Seraphine said simply. "Whatever comes next, I did not want to build the rest of my life on a lie I had chosen not to examine too closely." The carriage ride back to the estate passed in near silence, Seraphine watching the countryside roll past the window, turning over in her mind the shape of the conversation she now knew she must have with her husband, and beyond him, with her own father, whose money had funded an arrangement she now understood to be built on a foundation far uglier than anything she had been told when the marriage was first proposed to her. She arrived back at the estate as evening fell, and found the household waiting, gathered quietly in the front hall, the way they had been gathered on the day of her original arrival, though everything about the moment now felt entirely different. The easy performance of welcome, replaced by something quieter and more honest. A household that had earned, through months of careful patience and quiet grief, the right to finally see the truth they had guarded so carefully begin to bear its proper fruit. "I have seen her," Seraphine told them, standing in the same spot where she had once declared her preferences about how a household should be run, though the woman speaking those words now bore little resemblance to the confident young bride who had spoken them 6 months before. "I have heard the whole of what was done, and I intend to see that it is properly answered for, whatever the cost to my own position in this house." Odette, standing near the front of the assembled staff, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the cold morning months ago, when Cecile's carriage had disappeared around the bend of the eastern road. The first genuine sense, after so long a season of quiet grief and careful waiting, that justice, however imperfect and however late in arriving, was finally, truly, beginning to take its proper shape. The solicitor's letter arrived at the estate on a bright autumn morning, and by the time the Duke had finished reading it, his hands were shaking badly enough that he set it down twice before managing to reach the end. It laid out, in careful and formal legal language, the full weight of what was now arrayed against him. Cecile's claim, supported by the letter in the Duke's own hand that Odette had kept safe for so many months, alleged fraud in the dissolution of their marriage, and sought both a formal accounting and substantial compensation for the deception practiced against her. Seraphine's own family, once informed of the true circumstances behind the arrangement their money had funded, had withdrawn their support entirely, her father furious to learn that his daughter's marriage had been built on the quiet ruin of another woman's life, and threatening legal action of his own, regarding the funds already transferred under what he now considered false pretenses. And Seraphine herself, rather than standing beside her husband as the accusations mounted, had already begun the process of formally separating her name and her interests from his, informing him plainly, in a conversation that took place in the same drawing room where he had once shown her the family portraits with such eager pride, that she would not spend the rest of her life defending a man who had built their marriage on a foundation of such deliberate and calculated cruelty. "You will lose everything," he said to her, in that final conversation, his voice carrying more disbelief than anger now, the slow dawning horror of a man watching every careful arrangement he had made over the course of a difficult year collapse in the space of a single season. The estate, the household, the standing of this family in the county, all of it. "Perhaps," Seraphine said, "but I would rather lose everything honestly than keep it dishonestly, Alaric, and I think, in time, I will find that an easier thing to live with than the alternative would have been." He had no answer for that, because there was no answer that could restore what he had already lost, not merely the money and the standing that had once seemed so secure, but the loyalty of a household that had served his family faithfully for generations, and had chosen, in the end, when finally forced to choose, the side of truth over the side of convenient silence. The months that followed brought a slow, grinding accounting of everything that had been set in motion by that cold morning, nearly a year earlier, when Cecile had packed her own trunks in the dark. The Duke's finances, already fragile before the scheme had ever been conceived, collapsed entirely under the weight of the legal claims now arrayed against him, the debts he had once hoped to solve, through a convenient marriage, growing instead into an inescapable ruin, brought about by his own attempt to escape them dishonestly. The great house, which had stood for generations as a symbol of the family's standing in the county, was eventually sold to settle what remained of the claims against him, and the Duke himself, stripped of the title's practical wealth though not, by the strange mercies of inheritance law, of the title itself, retired to a much smaller property in a distant county, where the story of his fall traveled ahead of him, and ensured he was received, wherever he went, with a coolness that no amount of noble blood could entirely overcome. Cecile, for her part, did not return to the great house, choosing instead to remain at the modest cottage she had grown genuinely fond of during her exile, now purchased outright with a portion of the settlement finally awarded to her, a small and quiet property that she made entirely her own, in a way the grand estate, for all its 20 years of her stewardship, had never quite allowed her to feel it was. She and Seraphine remained in occasional correspondence, an unlikely friendship born of shared injury, two women who had each, in their own way, been used as instruments in someone else's scheme, and had found, in the aftermath, a kind of solidarity neither had expected to discover in the other. Seraphine herself returned to her family for a time, chastened, but not broken by the experience, and eventually, with the benefit of the settlement her own legal claims had secured, established herself independently, determined never again to enter into an arrangement whose true foundations she had not first taken the trouble to examine for herself. And the household, the true heart of the story that had unfolded across that long and difficult year, scattered gradually to new positions across the county, carrying with them the story of what had happened, told carefully and without embellishment to anyone who would listen, a warning against the particular cruelty of a wealthy man, too accustomed to having his convenience purchased at other people's expense. Gareth found a position as steward to a family known for its fair and honest dealings, a household where his decades of careful, unshakable composure were finally put to use, in service of people who deserved it. Agnes took on the running of a smaller but happier household not far from Ashcombe, close enough that she and Cecile continued to see each other regularly, the old warmth between mistress and housekeeper never having truly faded despite the year's upheaval. Marjorie opened a small bakery in the nearby market town, her fierce loyalty and her equally fierce cooking, finding a new and appreciative audience among the townspeople who came to know her simply as the woman who made the finest bread in the county, and asked no questions about why she had left her previous position so abruptly. And Odette, who had carried the weight of Cecile's trust for nearly a year, before finally judging the moment right to act upon it, found herself, in the end, invited to remain with Cecile at the Ashcombe cottage, no longer as a servant exactly, but as something closer to a companion, the two women having grown, through the long shared ordeal of waiting and watching and finally acting, into something that resembled friendship more than the old formal distance of mistress and maid. On a quiet evening some months after the whole affair had finally been settled, the two of them sat together in the cottage's small garden, watching the last light fade behind the hedgerows, and Cecile turned to Odette with a small, tired smile. "Do you ever think of him?" she asked. "Of the man who once sat at the head of that table, so certain the world would always arrange itself according to his convenience?" "Sometimes," Odette admitted. "I think of him sitting there that first evening, waiting for a supper that never came, surrounded by a house gone entirely silent around him. I think it was the truest moment of his whole life, though I doubt he understood it that way at the time." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 20 years, he sat at that table and believed the world existed to serve his convenience. And on that one evening, for the first time, he understood, even if only for a moment, what it felt like to sit at a table that had decided, quietly and completely, to serve him nothing at all." Cecile was quiet for a moment, considering this, and then she laughed, a real laugh, the first Odette had heard from her in a very long time, warm and unburdened, in a way it had not been since long before that cold morning, when her carriage had first pulled away down the eastern road. "Then perhaps," she said, "it was, in its own strange way, a kind of justice. Not the sort found in courtrooms or solicitors' letters, though we needed those too, in the end, but the older, simpler sort. The sort that says a man who builds his comfort on another person's suffering will eventually find himself sitting alone at his own table, waiting for a service that will never come again." They sat together in the gathering dark, the garden settling into evening quiet around them, and for the first time in nearly a year, neither of them felt the need to keep watch for what might be coming next, because the long reckoning had finally, fully, come and gone, and what remained, in its aftermath, was something neither of them had expected to find, but both of them now held with a quiet and lasting gratitude. Peace, hard won, and entirely their own.